the town that erases people. I moved to a small town where people who ask too many questions seem to just disappear from records and memory. So here's the thing about Havenwood. I moved here to disappear on my own terms. I'm 47, and after 12 years as a rare book archivist in Chicago, I was done. My wife, Anna, passed away 2 years ago, and the city felt like a ghost. I just wanted quiet, a small house with a garden, and a place where nobody knew my story. This town seemed perfect when I found it online. It looked like a postcard from a forgotten time. My new house was a modest little bungalow at the end of a quiet street. The day I moved in, my neighbor from the house next door came over. He was a kind old man named Arthur Abernathy who brought me a glass of lemonade. He told me he had lived in Havenwood his whole life. He said it was a good place to mend a broken heart. We talked for a while about his prize-winning roses. The next morning I saw a moving truck at his house. By noon, the entire place was completely empty. I walked over and asked the realtor, a woman named Sarah, what was happening. She gave me a strange, pitying kind of smile. She told me the Abernathy house had been vacant for at least 6 months. She said she was just there to do a routine inspection for the bank. I told her I had just spoken with him yesterday. She just shook her head and said I must be mistaken. She suggested that the stress of the move was probably getting to me. I went back to my porch and just stood there for a long time. The house next door was silent and very empty, but hanging from a hook on the porch ceiling were Mr. Abernathy's copper wind chimes. They were turning slowly in the afternoon breeze. I decided to just let the whole Abernathy thing go. I told myself that the realtor was probably right. Grief and stress can make you imagine things. So I tried to build a normal life here. I spent my days fixing up the old house, sanding floors and painting walls until my body ached. Anna would have loved this place and the work. We always talked about getting a small house somewhere quiet. It was our plan for when we finally retired. I met some of the locals during my trips to the hardware store and the post office. The town sheriff, a man named Brody, seemed like a genuinely nice guy. He always had a friendly wave and some advice about the best place to get coffee. The woman at the post office was always cheerful and asked how I was settling in. Everyone I met was pleasant and welcoming on the surface. But after a few weeks, I noticed something odd about our conversations. They all said the same kinds of things. They talked about the weather or the upcoming town festival. Whenever I asked a more personal question, their answers became vague. They would smile and change the subject back to something simple. It felt like everyone was reading from the same pleasant but empty script. I figured it was just how people were in a small, tight-knit community. They were probably just not used to outsiders asking too many questions. I chose to believe that for a while. My old habits as an archivist eventually got the better of me. I decided to visit the small town library to look up the history of my house. The library was a quiet, dusty place that smelled of old paper and wood polish. The librarian was a middle-aged woman who seemed friendly enough at first. I spent an hour looking through old property maps and town records. Then I found a shelf of recent town directories from the last decade. I pulled out the one from the previous year and flipped through the pages. My hand stopped when I found the entry for the house next to mine. The name listed was Arthur Abernathy. I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. I wasn't crazy, and he had been real. I took the book to the front desk to ask the librarian about it. Her friendly demeanor vanished the moment she saw what I was pointing at. She told me that those directories were often full of mistakes. Her hands were shaking slightly as she took the book from me. She said it was an outdated copy and she needed to remove it from circulation. The next day, I went back to the library. The directory from last year was gone from the shelf. When I asked her about it, she looked right through me. She claimed she had no idea what book I was talking about. That was the moment the illusion of this pleasant little town finally cracked. After leaving the library, my mind was a complete mess for days. For a moment, I felt certain they were hiding something significant. Then the corrosive doubt started creeping back in again. I began to wonder if I was the one who was wrong about everything. Maybe the librarian was just an eccentric person who hated administrative errors. My own professional past was filled with meticulous people like that. Maybe my grief over Anna really was making me paranoid and unstable. She used to say I had a tendency to see patterns where there were none. I would connect unrelated details into some grand, complicated theory. It was a joke between us, a part of my archivist brain I couldn't turn off. I started to think that was all this was. It was just a series of unfortunate coincidences I was weaving into a conspiracy. I decided I needed to talk to someone who was rational and level-headed. I went to the sheriff's office a few days later, feeling like a fool. Sheriff Brody welcomed me in with that same warm politician's smile. His office was exactly what you would expect. There was a large American flag in the corner and trophies from the local high school team. I told him everything that had happened so far, trying to sound calm. I talked about meeting Mr. Abernathy and the realtor's strange denial. I explained what happened at the library with the town directory. He listened to my entire story without interrupting me once. He just nodded along with a look of deep paternal concern on his face. When I was finished, he leaned back in his creaky leather chair. He told me that moving to a new place is always a difficult transition. He said it was especially hard for someone dealing with a major personal loss. He gently suggested that my mind might be playing tricks on me to cope. He said that people from big cities often mistake small-town quietness for secrecy. He even shared a story about another person who moved there from Boston. He said that person thought the town council was holding secret meetings. It turned out they were just planning a surprise birthday party for the mailman. He made it all sound so reasonable and completely logical. He made me feel like I was a hysterical outsider causing unnecessary trouble. I left his office feeling deeply and profoundly ashamed of myself. On the walk home, every friendly nod felt like a look of pity. I decided right then to stop digging for things that were not there. I would just focus on my house and keep to myself. I would finally find the peace I came here to find. For almost a month, I actually managed to keep my promise. I worked on the garden and avoided any unnecessary conversations with the neighbors. I tried to convince myself that this quiet life was all I ever wanted. I learned to ignore the empty house next door. My peace was a fragile thing, but it was real. Down the street lived a young family called the Potters. They had a little girl who would ride her bike in circles on their driveway. The wife ran a small online business selling custom cakes. I would sometimes see the delivery trucks coming and going from their house. One morning I woke up and saw the same realtor, Sarah, pounding a for sale sign into their lawn. The family was just gone, their house completely empty overnight. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. I immediately went to my computer and searched for the Potter's Bakery website. The domain was unregistered, and all their social media pages had been deleted. It was a digital ghost, just like Mr. Abernathy was a physical one. This was not a coincidence I could explain away. The pattern was too clear and too deliberate. Later that week, I was clearing some brush in the small patch of woods behind my property. Tangled in a low branch was a child's drawing, faded and damp from the rain. It was a crayon picture of a smiling family standing in front of their house. In the corner, written in a child's messy script, was the name Lily Potter. I held that piece of paper in my hand, and I knew for certain. My self-doubt was replaced by a cold, hard certainty. I was not crazy, and I was not mistaken. After that, I started feeling like I was being watched all the time. A town car would sit idling at the end of my street for hours. My phone line would sometimes make a strange clicking sound. The feeling of being watched finally pushed me over the edge. I realized they were not just going to let me leave. I knew that I was on the same path as Mr. Abernathy and the Potter family. My quiet life was just a waiting room for my own erasure. I decided that I had to find real, physical proof of what was happening. My mind kept going back to the Abernathy house next door. It was the beginning of everything, and I felt the answer was there. One night, after the entire street had gone dark, I put on dark clothes. I slipped out my back door and crept across the lawn. A window on the side of the house was slightly loose. I managed to pry it open without making too much noise. Inside, the house was cold and smelled strongly of fresh paint and bleach. They had scrubbed the entire place clean of any personality. It was a perfectly sterile and empty shell, which was terrifying. My archivist instincts kicked in, and I started looking for inconsistencies. I searched for anything they might have missed in their cleanup. In the back bedroom, I noticed one of the old floorboards was slightly warped. It did not sit flush with the others around it. I used my pocket knife to pry it up from the floor. Underneath, nestled in the dark space, was a small tin recipe box. My heart was pounding as I opened the lid. Inside were a few old photographs of Mr. Abernathy with a woman and a young boy. There was also a single piece of folded paper. On it were 4 words written in a shaky, desperate hand. The note simply said that they don't won't let you leave. I did not sleep at all that night. I just sat in my dark kitchen staring at the tin box and its contents. The photographs and the desperate note were undeniable proof of a life erased. This small box was the only thing standing between my sanity and their lies. The next morning, there was a sharp, loud knock on my front door. It was Sheriff Brody, but he was not smiling this time. He stood too close on my porch, a silent act of intimidation. His eyes were cold and hard as little gray stones. He told me that he was there because of a report from a concerned neighbor. He said someone had called in a prowler around the Abernathy property last night. He asked me directly if I had seen or heard anything unusual. It was not a question. It was a clear and direct accusation. I could feel my own heart pounding against my ribs. I looked him in the eye and told him that I had not seen anything at all. He just stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment. He then reminded me that trespassing was a very serious offense in this town. He said that people in my situation, grieving and alone, can sometimes make poor judgments. He told me to have a nice day before he turned and walked slowly away. His words felt like a carefully constructed threat. After he left, I understood that everything had changed completely. When I walked into the general store later, people openly stared at me. The friendly waves and nods were gone, replaced by hostile glares and deliberate silence. The clerk, who had once told me about his fishing trips, now weighed my groceries without a word. He refused to meet my eyes for the entire transaction. My internet connection at home became incredibly unreliable. It would drop every few minutes for no apparent reason. My cell phone service also started to fail inside the house. The town's friendly mask had been completely removed. Now I was just an outsider, and I was the enemy. Something inside me snapped after the sheriff's visit. The constant low-grade fear did not disappear, but it changed. It crystallized into a cold, hard anger that burned away my confusion and shame. For weeks, I had been their victim, a confused man they could manipulate. I finally accepted that the quiet person who moved here for peace was already gone. He had been erased just as surely as Mr. Abernathy. There was no peace to be found in Havenwood, only a quiet war. I stopped looking for answers or trying to understand their motives. I realized that understanding was a luxury I could not afford. My new goal was much simpler and much more direct. I decided that I was going to take their perfect, quiet little town apart piece by piece. I would use the very skills I had honed over a lifetime of quiet study. I drove 2 towns over to a city large enough to be anonymous. I paid cash for a new laptop and a burner phone. I made sure to buy them from 2 different big box stores. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control. From now on, I would not use my own tainted electronics for anything important. Back in my house, I began to build an archive of their crimes. I photographed every car that idled on my street and documented its license plate. I kept a detailed log of every internet and phone service disruption, complete with exact times. I scanned the photos and the note from Abernathy's tin box at high resolution. I encrypted the files and uploaded them to a secure cloud server using my new clean devices. I started researching the town's key figures from a library in another county. I looked into Sheriff Brody, the realtor Sarah, and the librarian. I found that Sarah's family owned half the commercial property in town. I learned Sheriff Brody's father and grandfather had been the sheriffs before him. My fear was replaced by a cold and methodical purpose. I was no longer the prey they were hunting. I had decided to become the archivist of their ruin. The town's response to my quiet rebellion was swift and brutal. They must have noticed my trips out of town or my changed demeanor. The subtle intimidation was replaced by overt acts of aggression. First, my mail stopped arriving completely. The mailbox remained empty day after day, a clear message from the post office. Then one morning I found all 4 of my car's tires had been slashed. They were cleanly punctured, a deliberate act to trap me at my house. I was physically isolated from the outside world. A few days later, I opened my front door to find a dead crow on the welcome mat. Its black wings were spread out as if in a final, desperate plea. There was no longer any room for misinterpretation. This was a direct and primal threat meant to terrorize me, Sheriff Brody paid me one final visit that same afternoon. All pretense of paternal concern was gone from his face. He told me that my activities were upsetting the good people of Havenwood. He said I was disturbing the peace with my snooping. He warned me that this town had a long history of dealing with troublemakers. He said that people who don't fit in often decide to leave for their own good. His threat was clear and hung in the air between us. I knew then that my time was running out. I did not cower or plead with him. I simply closed the door and documented everything. I photographed the slashed tires and the dead bird. I wrote down the exact time of Brody's visit and his thinly veiled words. I uploaded it all to my secure server. I was in too deep to ever go back now. I knew after Brody's last visit that they would be coming for me that night. The threats were no longer warnings. They were promises waiting to be fulfilled. I spent that entire day preparing my final decisive move. I worked on my clean laptop with a grim, focused energy that left no room for fear. My archive was complete, a meticulous and damning record of this town's quiet evil. I had the high-resolution scans of the photos from the tin box and the child's drawing. I had logs of the town's escalating harassment and my deep research into their leadership. I wrote a calm, factual cover letter titling the entire collection The Havenwood Archive. It was not an emotional plea for help, but a dispassionate report. I detailed the disappearances of Arthur Abernathy and the Potter family. I named Sheriff Brody and Sarah the Realtor as the primary orchestrators of the town's system. I compiled a list of over 100 email addresses. It included major national newspapers, state law enforcement agencies, and several federal investigators. I also added a dozen popular true crime bloggers and podcasters. I knew a story this strange needed to be attacked from all possible angles at once. I uploaded the entire encrypted package to a secure server. Then I used an anonymous service to schedule a mass email for 7 o'clock the next morning. It would send my entire archive to every single person on my list simultaneously. The moment I clicked the confirm button, the fight was over. An hour later, I saw headlights sweep across my living room wall. I did not try to hide or to barricade the door. I wiped the laptop's hard drive and sat in my living room chair to wait. I could hear multiple car doors close in perfect silent unison. The sound of my front door splintering open was simply the end. I live in a very quiet room now. The walls are white and the windows do not open. I do not know the name of this place. They give me my meals 3 times a day. They give me my medication in a small paper cup. I have no access to a computer or a telephone. I do not know what happened to my archive. I do not know if the world ever learned about Havenwood. Sometimes a visitor will leave a newspaper in the common area. Last week, I read a small article on an inner page. It mentioned a small, isolated town mired in federal investigations. The story was prompted by the bizarre online manifesto of a disturbed former resident. The article said the man was a former archivist suffering from a complete mental breakdown. It said he had developed an elaborate persecution complex after his wife's death. My name was never mentioned in the article. The town's secret is out, but I have been erased from my own story. There is an orderly who works here on the night shift. Sometimes I think I recognize his face from the Havenwood General Store. He never speaks to me, but he sometimes smiles a quiet, knowing smile. I spend most of my days just sitting in a chair. I stare at the blank television screen on the wall. Sometimes I can see my own reflection in the dark glass. The face I see is a stranger's face. It is just a ghost in a quiet room. If you enjoyed this video, support it with a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Your reaction helps me create new stories.